Hi, I'm Leanpub from Leanpub, and in this episode of the Front Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing Dr. Jeff Sutherland. Based in Lincoln, Massachusetts, Jeff has written a number of influential books and has worked to improve the productivity and profitability of many of the world's biggest companies. He's perhaps best known as co-creator of the Scrum Product and Process Development Framework, the founder of Scrum at Scale, and a signatory of the Agile Manifesto. You can follow him on Twitter at Jeff Sutherland and check out his organizations at scruminc.com and scrumatscale.com, which extends the core Scrum framework to deliver better results organization-wide. Jeff is the author of a book on Leanpub, First Principles in Scrum, Teams That Finish Early Accelerate Faster. In the book, Jeff explains Scrum starting from fundamental first principles, drawing fascinating parallels to areas as broad as physics, chemistry, medicine, biology, and martial arts, and the role they played in the exciting story of his search for hyperproductive Scrum. In this interview, we're going to talk about Jeff's very interesting background, career, his professional interests, and his book. And at the end, we'll talk a little bit about his work as an author. So thank you very much, Jeff, for taking some time to be on the Leanpub Front Matter podcast.
Well, it's great to be here. I want to support Leanpub since I'm an author and use the platform so much.
Thanks very much. I always like to start these interviews by asking people to talk about their, what I sort of jokingly call their origin story. Yours is just so fascinating. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you grew up and your first experiences on your path to, well, let's just say, to put it in one frame, creating Scrum.
Well, I grew up in Massachusetts in a small town. And when I was 8 years old, I looked at an encyclopedia and I saw a photo of cadets marching on the parade field at West Point. And I turned to my parents and I said, I'm going to go to school there. I just knew I was going to go to school there. They said, oh, you're crazy. That will never happen. But sure enough, in 1960, I arrived at West as a plebe. And towards the end of my time there, what's relevant to Scrum is I had the opportunity to go into the Air Force because the Air Force used to be the Army Air Corps. So they always had people moving from West Point into the Air Force. And I told them I would go into the Air Force if they made me a fighter pilot. And they agreed to send me to flight training. Said, you're going to have to prove yourself, get a top class to get into fighters, which I did. And then I spent over a decade flying mostly F-4 Phantom fighters and F-101s. And flew 100 missions over North Vietnam and fortunately managed to survive. Over 50% of the people I flew with got shot down. That's where I really learned about agility because your life depended on it. And the way we planned the missions and the way we were successful in coming back from those missions is all the operational aspects of Scrum really come from that experience. And particularly from John Boyd's OODA loop, because Boyd was the best fighter pilot ever in history and developed a way of thinking about it that not only applied to combat aircraft, but also applied to the design of aircraft and also applied to military strategy in general. And in fact, the U.S. Marines' strategy is totally John Boyd's OODA loop. So that's where Agile comes from for me, from that experience.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's so much just to sort of break in there because there's just so much to talk about even with that story. So for example, I know from some of the research I did for this interview that one of the tactics that you adopted and that you tried to train pilots to do was to act, because it was the most contested. North Vietnam was the most contested airspace in aerial combat at the time, I think, or up to that time, and that adopting a pattern as though you're being shot at, you're being targeted all the time, was something that you came up with and that you practiced yourself. But that even if you told people to do this, that people just wouldn't do it. Which is they would fly straight at the target instead of weaving around.
People would rather die than change. a lot of them. And they did.
That's
and that's true even today in business.
Yeah, no, yeah, that's a powerful way to put that truth. Another thing to unpack from there too is that I've met a few West Pointers in my day. One of them is the governor of Maryland right now, and it's a training academy not just for officers but for leaders.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what that was like.
Well, the interesting thing about West Point is that it is dedicated to leadership, and it is probably the leading leadership training institute in the U.S. for sure, maybe the world, and it's trained virtually all of the great military leaders. And when we first got there, the first meeting, I remember I'm sitting, beside my new classmates, and they said, look to your left and look to your right. One and two of you are not going to be here at the end of this year. And then they proceeded to say, we have psychological experts here. We're going to take your mind apart and reassemble it to shift your value system from whatever it is your family taught you to be self-serving, right? Or to support them. We're going to move that into duty, honor, country. Your mission is to support the nation. And that's going to require a completely different psychological makeup. And they proceeded to do that. They're very expert at it. It was one of the first great transformations in my life, was actually going through that process and coming out of there really a different person from when I came in.
Yeah, I've interviewed a couple of Marines in my time here, and one thing I've heard about is the breaking you down and building you back up.
Yeah,
and everyone going through the same initial training, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah,
is a hallmark of that training, so that the officers and the non-officers have a shared background.
Well, at West Point, everybody's being trained to be officers. But the unique thing about it is, if you've been through that process, even today, you feel a level of trust for West Pointers that is remarkable. Not that they're all trustworthy, but percentage-wise, you can count on 95% of them to watch your back. And because of the pressure of the system that you went through together, you understand certain values are in common.
And that the service of that you're part of a group that's in service of a higher mission, and not just yourself.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that was the whole major point of it. In order to lead, you need to be serving a higher purpose than just yourself and your family, and we need to give you that perspective. That's the goal.
And you went on from your military service to do a PhD, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. It was, fascinating.
Yeah,
cellular biology.
Well, one of the things that would happen with academy grads is after you had 5 to 7 years in, there was a program where you could go back and teach at the academy. So they really wanted the instructors at the academy to be people who had been out there in the field. And since I was in the Air Force, I applied for the Air Force Academy program. And I said, I want to go back to Stanford and get a degree in statistics, mathematics, and computing, basically. I agreed to do that, and I spent a remarkable couple of years at Stanford, and the courses that impressed me most were in the medical school. And the head of the Department of Psychiatry at that time, who had the most popular class in all of Stanford. Later became the dean, Professor Kachadorian, was actually a student of my father-in-law, who had been head of medicine at the American University in Lebanon. And he told me my father-in-law had actually brought modern medicine to the Middle East. And he had incredible respect for him. So as soon as he found out I was there, he contacted me and he said, I have a bunch of research I'm doing. I'd like to make you're an expert in computing and statistics. I need that. Why don't we work together? So we published, I think, 5 medical papers together while I was at Stanford. And then at the Air Force Academy, I continued that publication. And I talked with him about, should I be, I was interested maybe in going back to school and becoming an MD. He recommended against that. He said, you should build on everything you've done. So don't go back and do the MD degree. That's going to be kind of going sideways. Build on your statistics and computing background. So I applied for a PhD program at a medical school. Now, this was really significant to Scrum because my department chairman, who actually hired me out of the Air Force Academy into medical school, wanted me to come there and run a large grant, a cancer research grant. And it supported, was one of the major cancer center grants. And this one was for the entire state of Colorado. So I ran that for over a decade and probably spent about $30 million. A lot of it on my own research, doing supercomputer modeling of the human cell to try to figure out what happens to a cell that turns it into a cancer cell, and can we back up that cell back into a normal cell? Turns out to be, yes, you can do that. Now, after doing that, I became a real student of complex adaptive systems. How do complex systems, particularly biological systems, evolve, grow, change? And it turns out that a team is a complex adaptive system. So is a person, so is a company. So that cellular research is really the theoretical basis of what became Scrum. Because Scrum is based on complex adaptive systems. What happened later in the 80s was a whole bunch of research started initially at Los Alamos Laboratories. And when I got my PhD in the medical school, I became a professor of radiology. My minor was in radiation physics. So I'm trained as a medical physicist. And I spent a bunch of time down at Los Alamos, published papers with some of these guys. But one of them, this guy, Christopher Langdon, wrote a paper on simulating the evolution of life on a computer and proving that the more degrees of freedom you give that system as it's evolving, the faster it's evolved. And I spent over a decade in the medical school and as a professor of radiology, but then I was hired out of the medical school into a large banking company, running 150 banks all across North America, to be their head of systems, right? Their lead architect and systems, because we were the experts at the medical school in certain technologies that the bank was newly adopting technologies. And so they brought me in there, and now I'm in industry and I'm looking at what they're doing, and I'm saying, all your projects are late. I went into the CEO's office. I said, hey, Ron, have you noticed all your projects are late? He said, yes. He says, we run 150 banks, and at least 5 of them call me every morning. It's either the CEO or the CIO, and they scream at me. And I said, well, it's not getting better. It's actually getting worse. Every time you're late, you have new procedures, more meetings, more policies, and it slows you down. And it was really while I was at the bank, I read Chris Belanger's paper on it's really the degrees of the freedom of a system that allows it to move quickly. And what I saw that the bank was shutting down the degrees of freedom, making it harder and harder to get things done until things became so slow. It was like the systems were in concrete, right?
Yeah,
you couldn't change them.
just to jump in, it's so interesting. I know that part of that story is that they were using Gantt charts, which were from kind of like, I believe, pre-World War I or something like that at this bank in the 80s. But I want to sort of like just to sort of give a little bit of framework for when we eventually get to talking about your book. When you're talking about these terms like degrees of freedom, for example, are coming partly from physics. And you write about this in the book. And so like a lot of the things you've said already, for example, about your work in radiology, I mean, you were working with artificial intelligence back then as well, and training artificial intelligence as well. And so learning about that, but there's also things about how, you're talking about like an individual and a team. There's also a kind of, you can draw a parallel between that and like a kind of particle and a wave and things like that. So I just wanted to jump in before you tell the really interesting story about what happens next in your work. But there's all this. If you read the book, there's all this going on in the background of what for listeners for what
right
Jeff's talking about. So anyway, sorry to jump in with that context, but so then you're at this bank, or
okay. So going back to the medical school, when I first got there, and I was spending most of my time in the radiology department, even before I got the PhD, and then I was a professor in radiology. The department chairman and I got along really well. He said, there's this old computer in the basement that we use for radiation therapy for tumors, cancer patients. Nobody's using it right now. You can use that for your stuff. So I went down there, and it was an old PDP-7 that started up with a paper tape. And when you sit down in front of it, it has hundreds of lights on it. They're all dark. You take this paper tape, it's about a foot long, with little punched holes, and you feed it in, it goes zzz, and boom, all the lights start dancing. It was like magic. It taught me, wow, a few simple rules generate this incredible complex behavior, this kind of bootstrap phenomenon, which is actually fundamental to physics. Now, in my book, one of the most remarkable things that's happened in physics in a decade or two is Wolfram's physics project, where they try to simulate the universe on a computer. And one of the things they found was things are unpredictable. In order to predict anything, like when your project's going to be done, requires infinite computing power. And therefore, humans don't know. And in fact, even God tell when the project's going to be done until the whole simulation runs to the end. And let me just finish this, because this goes direct to the Gantt chart thing you brought up. Many years later, I'm working with a venture capital group who I still work with, Open View Venture Partners out of Boston. I'm sitting there with an investment team, 6 or 8 really senior investment. They've been in the business for 30 years. I get to explain Scrum to them at a lunch meeting. It only took 15 minutes. These guys are really smart. At the end of 15 minutes, they said, we got it. And the thing we get is that Scrum is a much better predictor of when things are going to be done, because you're not measuring hours, you're measuring actually feature points, stuff that we can actually deliver and sell. And And to that is even more important to us than productivity, because we're in board meetings and we're looking at the Gantt chart and we have to figure out when are they going to need more money and how much are they going to need. And that depends on the date and obviously the quality of the product. And they said, we never can make that calculation. I said, never. And one of them said, in 30 years, I've never seen a Gantt chart that was correct. So I turned to the rest of them. I said, have any of you ever in 30 years ever seen a correct Gantt chart? Everybody said, no. There are no correct Gantt charts. They are 100% wrong. And so anybody that try to drive things with a Gantt chart has this huge risk of failure. They're setting themselves up for failure. And even today, there are still some people using those things. We still have huge projects failing because of this. So, all of this became very clear, really, in the theory of how complex systems work. That you just can't do that. You're going to create a company that fails if you persist in that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going back in my head to what you said earlier about how people would rather die than change. And when it comes to this question that, like, I've probably talked to quite a few Leanpub authors who've tried to implement Scrum in organizations as consultants, without coming in with the kind of weight and momentum that you would have had. And they have the problem of trying to get people to change and like move on from older models and things like that. And it's just so incredibly hard. And that's one of the reasons that I really love how you bring up, computational irreducibility, right? It's just this kind of bracing fact of existence.
Yeah.
We just can't predict.
Right. Computational irreducibility is the first principle of Wolfram's physics project. And it basically says to predict the outcome requires infinite computing. And since we don't have that, things are unpredictable, fundamentally unpredictable. That's where Agile comes from. And it is like the law of gravity. So we still have these, particularly in management of companies, we still have people that are arrogant enough to think that they can predict something that God can't predict. And that gets them and the company into big trouble. And it's getting worse and worse because the pace of change now is getting so fast. And now with AI on the scene, it's accelerating beyond the comprehension of most people.
So that reminds me of something, a podcast I listened to when I was researching for this interview. You said something that made me feel much more sane than I sometimes feel. And you said, don't believe the financial analysts. You added media and politicians to that because they're always looking at what's already there, rather than what's changing and what's, the way things are going.
Yeah. One of the most interesting things in my book, I have this chart of the projections of when coal plants are no longer going to be used. And you can see every year the experts project that there'll be as many coal plants in 50 years from now as there are today. But every year, the number of them is going down, 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 down. But they're still projecting, in 2050, we'll have as many as we have today, even though, they're vanishing, 10 to 20% of them are going away every year. And part of this is the incumbent bias, okay? The politicians, the analysts, and the experts, they're incumbents. They get paid to tell you something that's not true, that things are not going to be different tomorrow. And so anybody that has a clear head and who's a critical thinker will not believe them, will constantly do your own research and check. some things they say might be useful to you, but unless you do your own research, most of what they say is going to be wrong.
Yeah, a really clear example that I know you've talked about in the past is Tesla, for example. So, and one of my jokes is that like the only industry that's not as industry analysts that aren't as dumb as book publishing industry analysts are car industry analysts. And so a lot of them see Tesla come along and they're like, oh, it's going to be like fuel cars, but with electric motors in it. And it's like, no. What's happening behind Tesla and SpaceX and things like that is thinking about not just the machine that makes the machine, but the machine that makes the machine that makes the machine, right? And so, which is kind of what Scrum is, right, to some extent,
right?
I would venture to say, but
that's an interesting.
Yeah, the idea that like when you go up to a certain level, the machine is going to be a process. But what people just, and this is again, sort of when I was listening to your interviews, it made me just feel so much more sane, is like, I've always been shouting at the car industry analysts, you don't understand. They're changing the way cars are made. They're not just changing the engine. And this is going to speed up and improve the manufacturing process to a point where it's a change, not just in degree, but in kind of what's actually happening.
Absolutely. Tesla is the most agile company in the world. I have a $50 billion investment fund. About half of it is in Tesla. So I've studied them very carefully now for years. I bought one of their first roadsters.
Oh.
And today, I mean, I've been there and I've done Scrum training inside of Tesla. But they use digital management and AI to guide autonomous teams that are changing every day. And they put more than 20 new hardware software changes in the cars rolling down the assembly line every week, which is about 1,000 times faster than historically Ford and General Motors change things. And it is such a force that it's not only disrupting the industry, most of the players are going to go bankrupt, and it's just a matter of time. I remember in 1990, I wrote a paper. I said, General Motors is going to be bankrupt in 20 years. They wouldn't let me publish it because they said, that's anti-American. General Motors, they're the good old USA. They're never going to go bankrupt. They took 17 years.
Yeah. You were very close in your prediction.
Yeah. I was conservative.
Yes.
And the threat of Tesla is way beyond anything Toyota ever came up with. They could put Toyota out of business.
I mentioned origin stories at the beginning of the interview, and there's kind of two that I really was looking forward to talking to you about. You mentioned personal transformation, and I know that you had an experience in the early 90s that's sort of not necessarily all that well known about the origins of Scrum, which is a sort of a moment of epiphany or enlightenment. And I was wondering if you would talk a little bit about that story.
Well, one of the things that happened to me going back to Vietnam, flying on 100 missions over North Vietnam, one day they said, hey, we got a plane that's heading to Sydney, Australia for R&R, rest and recreation, and there's empty seats. Anybody that wants to, you can grab it and go off for a week. And so I jumped on a plane with a buddy, and we went down to Sydney. It was a great city. And within the first day, he met a girl, and he was off. He was gone for the rest of the week with her. So I'm wandering around bookstores, and I walk into this bookstore, and a book falls down on the head, and I pick it up. It's on Tibetan Buddhism. And that starts me on a long journey. It's 1967. And by 1993, around the time that Scrum is starting up, I'm actually going to not only to Buddhist conferences, but I'm going to these initiations by senior Tibetan monks. And most of them are into, I remember one I went to, and at the end of the ceremony, the English translator says, "You've just been initiated as a lay monk. And so here's what you have to do. One of the things is you need to meet the Dalai Lama." And I've done my best ever since then to fulfill that. But around that time, the power of those initiations and my meditation was such that when I was coming into work for Scrum or starting that team, things would happen and I would feel compelled. This energy in my gut would compel me to do something in a way that I would never normally do it. I was very much in the head all the time, intellectual, but it was all feeling driven. And in about 3 months of that going on every day, the first Scrum team as we know it formed. And it was always about all about the people and their interactions and how they felt, and which was something I didn't normally consider. As a manager, I was always kind of intellectually, we got to incentivize these people. We have to discipline them if they don't cooperate. No, that was all out the window. It was like, it's all about energy, the energy of the people, the energy of the feeling, the dynamics of the collaboration. All of that was what powered up Scrum. So that was, we probably wouldn't have Scrum without that. I would say for sure.
And was that the time when you came up with the concepts of the three roles in Scrum, you and your collaborators?
The way the three roles evolved is I came in there, they hired me. I was president of another company, and the CEO of Easel, they had been looking for a new VP of engineering. Easel was a very successful company, global company. And he said, we've interviewed dozens of candidates, and we even hired one of them, he said, but I have this new company I just bought with a new technology, and we need to re-engineer all our products in this new technology. And we need someone who has repeatedly demonstrated that they can deliver new products that are really, game-changing in industry. And you've done that at least 3 times. So will you come in and we'll give you a small team of our best people, and we'll support you with whatever you need, because this is the most important thing for the company right now. And so I came in, I was kind of like a chief engineer at Toyota. We're going to have a new thing. I had to figure it out. I had to rally the troops, get the whole company, engaged with it. And I got all the support I needed. So as we're building this new software product, which I was in an industry meeting last year, and one of the people in the meeting said, "Hey, Jeff, I used that product back in the early days when it was first created, and I used it this week. It is one of the 5 best products that's ever been built." So not only did we get Scrum out of that team, we got one of the best products that's ever been created in the industry, even to this day. But let's circle back to the original question. So, because I can go any different ways. The original question was about the roles.
Yeah.
So as we started to formalize Scrum based on, we got the name Scrum from Takeuchi Nanaka's paper, the new product development game. Our team was reading, I said, to do new product development, you have to research everything that's been ever written about the area you're working in. And I said, and that takes at least 1,000 papers. And we're going to start studying them. We got up to about 300 and we came upon Takeuchi Tanaka's paper. And every time someone would get a really good one, we'd get everybody to read it the same day. And at the end of the day, we'd have a retrospective on the paper. And when we did this, the team said, we should call what we're doing Scrum. Because that paper describes how hardware companies build product really fast and really well. And one of our lead clients is Ford Motor Company, and we could hand that to Ford Motor Company management, and they'll believe us. We're not just a bunch of software developers cooking up some new tool.
Yeah.
Takeuchi Tanaka, these guys are Harvard Business School, and people are saying this is the way, the new way of working. And when we decided on the word Scrum, someone on the team said, what should we call the team leader? And someone else said, the Scrum Master. Because we've been learning a little about Scrum. We watched some rugby games. We love these Adidas videos of the All Blacks team in New Zealand. And there was this great tool where in training, the guy scrumming would hit this machine. The machine was called the Scrum Master. It gave you really good.
I didn't know that.
So we're going to call a team leader the Scrum Master. And his name was John Somniatalis. And so what I did was I took, the chief engineer has really three roles. Part of it is the team leader of the people building. So I gave John that piece. In the third sprint, the team accelerated 500% one sprint. They took a month's worth of work and they completed it in 4 days. And as soon as they did that, we had to ship the first release. I only had 3 months. We're doing monthly sprints. I had 3 months of backlog, but now they were 5 times as fast. I needed 15 sprints of backlog, and I needed it right now. So I immediately went to the senior VP of marketing. I said, we got a real problem. We need your best guy. He needs to be 100% devoted to this team, building backlog. His name was Don Rodner. He became the first product owner. So I offloaded the product backlog to Don, and I held on to the management piece. The chief engineer's goal is not only to build the product, but to get the whole company to manufacture and deploy the product. So the chief engineer has to work across the entire organization to roll that product out. So I still held out of that function. Now, even before we got the product Scrum Master, back when I was in medical school, the technologies I was using to do my research, which was really supercomputing level research, I was working with a Bell Labs team that had Kernighan and Ritchie on it. One of them invented the C language, and the other was one of the inventors of Unix. And these guys had developed tools that were very useful in medical computing research, which was really done in Fortran at the time. And they had developed this package called RAT4, which it was really interesting. A little Fortran program, you ran it, and it created a RAT4 compiler. And from that day forward, you only programmed in RAT4, and you were in a modern computing environment. It was like, again, this little bootstrap of this little Fortran program pops you into a complete new dimension. And, that was very similar to the bootstrap back in radiology with that paper tape starting up the PDP-11. It really amazed me. And I'm bringing this up because Scrum itself is a bootstrap. If you apply it well, it boots the team into a different dimension of performance, of feeling about the work, the quality of the work, so forth. So before we even got the product owner Scrum Master, we started the team. I said, we're going to set up the team like they did it at Bell Labs. At Bell Labs, they only had one job title, member of technical staff. So I said, you're all going to be member of technical staff. They said if they had a Nobel laureate on the team, they might make him senior member of technical staff. So we only had members of technical staff, team members, and then we created the Scrum Master, then the product owner. That's the evolution of the three roles. And that is critical to performance. And I remember one of our most recent case studies in Rocket Mortgage, the biggest mortgage company in the United States. Their managers came to Scrum at Scale training and then became Scrum at Scale trainers. And one of the first things they did was they took this huge SAFe implementation they had that had 15 different roles on teams. They cut it to 3. Then they really focused on the product owner, the Scrum Master. They said, okay, the product owner is supposed to double the value and the Scrum Master is supposed to cut the cost in half. And that gives you a 400% increased performance, which they did. They took SAFe and they've made it go 400% faster, mainly by driving only the 3 roles and then getting people in the roles that could actually deliver. So the roles are extremely, extremely important that you get that right.
Yeah, and I know you have one very sort of direct story that you have to tell about transforming the way surgical rooms were kind of cleaned after surgery at a hospital.
Yeah.
That combines these ideas of like process improvement and doubling sort of process efficiency and the value at the same time, but also, getting more people through the healthcare system, helping to heal people better, which is why there's all these sort of different dimensions of like, it's easy to get sort of, I think when you're thinking about productivity and products and, saying terms like that and things like that,
right?
Companies, making more money for their shareholders, which is important. But these processes can just radically improve the quality of our lives and the way we do things. And I was wondering, and the reason I bring that up, that specific example, is because you brought up feelings before in that very powerful story about your experience with Buddhism and training and things like that. And I think I know a lot of people, when you bring up feelings, they're like, oh, swear word, we've got to think about feelings now because we're being all lovey-dovey or something like that. And it is not what that is about at all. It is about fundamentally transforming processes for the better.
Where I've gone with the feeling and the new book, really into neuroscience. And there are 7 well-researched areas of neuroscience that are critical to a high-performing Scrum team. And in terms of feeling, one of them is actually the dopamine high that runners get. Marathon runners, they go out and run, they get high. They're releasing dopamine to the brain. In agile practices, we work in increments. We look for quick wins that generates that feeling of like winning a football game, right? Because that releases a dopamine high. And so it's not about feelings, it's about performance that's created by neurochemistry that makes you feel really great. and a good Scrum Master has got to get that team feeling really great to get a really high level of performance. There's no way around it.
Yeah, and this specific example that I know about the hospital, for example, was there was you were brought in and you were realizing that like one of the biggest impediments to the sort of like efficiency of the surgical process was that the rooms weren't being cleaned quickly enough, or they could have been cleaned more quickly. And then so you formed a team, and it turned out the sort of head surgeon, who I believe you made the Scrum Master, was did not behave well towards the cleaners. And when you informed them, hey, you need them to be feeling good about what they're doing. You need to empower them to make decisions and use what they know, because they're the ones there doing it.
They're the ones that actually know how to fix your problem. You don't know how to fix your problem.
Yeah, but
they were.
Yeah, yeah. And if you let them feel good about what they're doing, compliment them for doing a good job, give them the tools to do it better, they'll do it better.
Right. Yeah, it only took two. They had surgery generates about half of the revenue for a big hospital. And this big hospital in Boston is a $7 billion hospital. So they're generating like close to $4 billion in surgical fees a year. And so the speed at which the patients flow through has a huge problem. And their biggest slowdown, it took them an hour to turn around a room. And they've been working on that for 20 years, trying to get it shorter, though no success. And they had a lean expert that the hospital had hired. He came to our Scrum training. He said, Jeff, come in and help me tackle that problem, because that has a bigger financial impact on the hospital than anything. And in 2 weeks, we collapsed it from 1 hour to 30 minutes. And that showed that increased the number of surgeries that could be done by 20%. And if you run the numbers, that's $700 million of free money a year from 2 1-week spreads of Scrum. That's how effective it is in that kind of environment.
It's just incredible. And so I mentioned there were 2 origin stories I had to ask you about. One was Scrum and just sort of how powerful and transformative that's been. And well, the other thing is the Agile Manifesto, which I think there's maybe some listeners might be have been waiting all this time to hear you maybe talk a little bit about that experience and what that was like.
Well, I've been doing a great presentation about this lately to both traders and to general public. The first day of the meeting, it was called by a guy named Bob Martin, this software expert, and he invited only industry experts, just by invitation only. And he tried to get the leading thought leaders across the planet who were the leaders in software development. And he got a lot of them there. There were a couple of people that couldn't make it and regretted it later. But the first day, we had these really powerful people talking about what they were doing and arguing and very opinionated. And the only thing we could agree on the first day is that we needed to call what we're doing by a common name in order to be competitive in the industry. And we agreed on the word Agile. And it was because there's a book behind me. It's a gold cover. It's a book about 100 hardware companies that created an Agile consortium. And Mike Beadle, one of the Scrum guys, had that book. And he said, I think we should call ourselves Agile. What most people don't realize is all of this comes from hardware. Taki Tanaka's paper was all about hardware companies. The Agile book I just talked about, it's all about hardware companies. We just were software guys that took what they'd already figured out in hardware and started applying it to software, right? So it works absolutely as well in hardware. That's where it came from, as it does in software. And it works in healthcare, it works in government, it works everywhere. So the first day we agreed the word Agile. Then we come in the second day, we're still arguing, debating, everybody has these opinions. And we have a coffee break at 10 o'clock in the morning. And Martin Fowler, who was one of the guys on the first extreme programming team, a well-known author, goes to the whiteboard. He said, hey, anybody wants to stick around? I'd like to talk about, is there anything we can agree on? Because this group doesn't look like they're ever going to agree on anything except the word Agile. and we're going to spend 3 days here and wind up with nothing except a word. So 8 of us stay in the room. And he says, what do you think makes great teams? Somebody said, well, it's all about the people and how they work together, right? Oh, Martin writes on the board, individuals and interactions. And people said, yeah, they're a lot more important than any process or tool. And Martin says, well, we don't want to put down process and tools. Some of you are actually tool vendors, but we do want to emphasize we value individuals' interactions over process and tools. What else? Well, within 10 minutes, we had the 4 values of the Agile Manager. So the coffee break was over. Everybody else comes back. I remember it was one of those pregnant moments. Everything got really silent as the other 9 guys were looking at the whiteboard. And then one of the guys says, the founder of the wiki and many software tools, says, that's awesome. And everybody said yes, and we did it with no edits. People have asked, could we have ever come up with that with 19 guys in the room all debating? And I think the general opinion is no, it took a smaller group to kind of pull it together. That's how we got the Agile Manifesto in a coffee break. And then we spent the next day and a half writing the 12 principles that support the values. And for us, it was kind of like, we wrote this on a note. It was like a bottle threw in the ocean. Everybody read it. And it changed everything. Pretty amazing.
Thank you very much for sharing that story. And it really did change everything. I mean, for people who are listening to this, or maybe who aren't familiar with concepts like Scrum or concepts like Agile, the reason that Jeff and I can have this conversation over Zoom, which now has an AI companion that I'm looking at, and all kinds of other things, is because of this transformation in the way that software was created. It was before that there was, I don't know if we've actually used the word waterfall yet. We've talked about Gantt charts and things like that. But, the sort of high level story that I always like to tell when I have a guest who's sort of like an agile kind of, consultant or something like that, is like, imagine before you could actually start writing code, on a product, a software product, you had someone writing a 30-page Microsoft Word document, and then someone sort of, divvying it up into sort of like a individual task, and they just dump that task on you as a programmer, like you're a bricklayer, and they're like, make this brick, put this brick down, put this brick down, put this brick down. And then 2 years later, you come out with maybe let's say 6 months later, the feature is actually kind of deployed. Instead, we've got these incredible things. I remember talking to Dave Farley about working on a kind of stock exchange kind of system where they're deploying features like multiple times a day on a software product that's doing like millions of transactions a minute, and if it
the best companies are deploying multiple features every day to production. And I'm always astonished. You talk to people, oh, we got this bank, we can't do a release more than once a quarter. I'm like, I was trading in Germany, and I had 7 guys from the strategy team from Deutsche Bank in the class. They said, what are you guys doing here? They said, this month, Amazon started doing consumer loans on the internet. And they have all the information, and they can deliver a loan in like 3 minutes, and it takes us 3 weeks. And within a week, we lost almost 100% of our consumer loan business. That's why we're here. So there are so many companies out there that are still sitting like Deutsche Bank, thinking that somebody like Amazon's not going to come by and just take all their business in a week. It's really hard to wake people up. And now with AI coming online, the prediction right now from some of the leading thinkers is artificial general intelligence by 2025. That means a machine is as good as a human. When we get there, some of the CEOs of AI companies are saying there will be no software developers left.
That reminds me of an interview I did a few years ago with the great Jerry Weinberg, and he talked about he was of a vintage where I believe the first computer he ever worked with was himself. That was his job. He was a computer, and he had this great story about being there at like the early days of IBM getting into computing, and he was in a room. I hope I get this right, but it's the spirit of it is correct. He was in a room with a bunch of IBM executives who they thought programming was something you'd do once. And when they learned, no, you're going to have programmers constantly programming. They were just like hangdog, they were so disappointed. And it's just so fascinating to think that we might be coming around to a point where like their wish finally comes true.
Yeah.
And it's as sort of interesting and scary as that is at the same time in so many ways. But this idea. There's something I really wanted to talk to you about. Like I know you've talked about like the existential kind of moments that companies can have. COVID and the pandemic was one of those where people who weren't agile or what have you, like, and who couldn't handle remote work just because of processes. You said like lots of companies went under, and like, just yesterday I'm reading a headline about how like the New York Times is there's going to be a strike in its programmers because they're forcing them back to the office out of some nonsense. Anyway, can you talk a little bit about remote work and COVID and the sort of experience you had people about that?
One of the really interesting things about Scrum, and in some ways surprising to me, is that number one, it works in every country. We have Scrum in every country in the world. And number two, it works as well remote as it does in person if you do it well. We've run multiple papers showing hyperproductive, globally distributed teams running as fast as the best teams that are local. And so I mentioned the COVID. When the COVID thing happened, as soon as it happened, I actually got a note from a product owner at one of the big drug companies. He said, "Jeff, thank God we started Scrum last fall because, as soon as COVID hit, we had to shut the office down. Everything was in our Scrum tooling. We just kept going. I mean, but our competitors who were traditional project management, they are dead for at least 6 months. And it's going to take them a year or two to bail themselves out. And we're just nonstop because of the Scrum Agile process."
In the interests of time and respecting your time as well, just before we go on to talk a little bit about your work writing as a writer, I have to bring up martial arts, which is something that you talk about and you write about in your book. I have a little bit of a background in that myself. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, your experience of martial arts and how that relates to Scrum.
Well, it was I was working while I was still in the Air Force. I was working in the peace movement. And I was a leader in the anti-nuclear movement at the time. Surprisingly, while I'm still an officer in the Air Force. And so I wanted to know how to develop a nonviolent strategy in an environment of violence. And, I looked at all the martial arts, and one of the things that really intrigued me was Aikido, because it's a totally nonviolent martial art. And Master Ueshiba, who founded Aikido, was an amazing guy. His personal power could throw multiple people across the room without even touching them. There's a lot of videos of that on the internet. So I looked around Denver and I found that there was this guy, Gaku Hama, who had been the gardener for Ueshiba and spent many years training in his dojo. And I think he's billed as Ueshiba's last disciple. And he was training in Denver. So I started going to the dojo. And what I was really interested in was the mindset. I mean, I did all the things, but the thinking, always leading with an open hand. When someone tries to harm you, actually using their energy to neutralize them, and being so effective at it that, no one can harm you. You're not harming anybody, but no one can harm you, right? So I spent a couple of years in the dojo in Denver. But then around the time Scrum started, for some reason, I felt motivated to go get back into the Aikido dojo. And in Cambridge, they had one of the most senior disciples of Master Ueshiba, a guy named Kanai, an 8th degree black belt. And I went into that dojo. I'll never remember the first day. I'm sitting there in my white outfit, and he had half of the people in the room were black belt Aikido masters, right? Those are the kind of people that he had there. And he does a demo where he has 3 of these black belts attack them at once from multiple directions. And he does some whirling thing with his body and his fingers. And these guys go, whoa, 6 feet in the air, flying across the room without him even touching them. And it feels like a room that a huge truck just went whoa through the room. And I'm rocked. And I'm like, what was that? The black belt next to me says, that's the power of Chi. And so I spent about a year, and he always would work with the new guys. Of course, I was always a new guy. And I remember when he would throw me, his energy was so powerful. He would throw me, but then his energy would be support me like a baby and just lay me gently on the mat. Unbelievable. So I've always found that martial artists are very good at Scrum. And one of the guys we worked with in recent years was a world-class Tai Chi master. And he's been very effective at agile transformations. I asked him how he does it. He says it's all about the energy. If they get out of line, I whack them. He doesn't hit them physically. He whacks them with his energy, and they straighten up. So, again, it's all about energy. It's all about power. I mean, I think before we end, I should talk to you about the thing that is what most interesting to me right now. Is I have a healthcare startup, and I've been asked to create a framework for health that's like the Scrum framework. Something that's so simple, in 2 days you could pick it up, and our theme song is, we're going to give you twice the energy with half your current stress. Because what we found is that the company that trains Olympic athletes has analytics that, I don't know if you can see this on the...
Oh, a little bit, yeah.
The Garmin bought their analytics, has it on the watch, and the blue line at the top is energy. You can see my energy is running even late in the day. It's still running almost 70%. And I've run a 5K already today. So if I hadn't run that 5K, I'd be about 15 points higher. And the blue is most of it is blue. That's the stress level.
Mm.
So the blue is a rest state. It's like when you're sleeping.
Mm.
So I'm talking to you now, and I've had a few spikes earlier, but right now, in the blue, my stress is like 5%. My energy is almost 80%. And what I do in my book is I talk about physics. How does physics relate to an agile transformation? One of the best analogies is Newtonian mechanics. In order to move an object, you have to apply force. And the force is proportional to the mass, right? F equals ma. So particularly the organization is large, you need a lot of force to accelerate that organization. And force applied over a distance is work. And so to do twice the work in half the time, work divided by time is power. Okay. To do twice the work in half the time, you need 4 times the power to make it happen. And obviously, that power is going to come from the agile leaders trying to move that organization. And it's all about energy. And so if you're going to have a successful agile transformation, you need 4 times the personal power. And you probably need many people running at that level to budge that organization, right? And the beauty of this today is that we can put, with the analytics they have right now, you can monitor yourself 24/7, dozens of healthcare parameters. You can do a deep analysis like these first beat analytics, know everything about yourself. And you can you get the biofeedback to take your energy state to a level. And I'm starting to talk about Scrum teams. I mean, hey, the retrospective today, I just want to see you watch. If we're at the end of the day on Friday and you're less than 50% battery and your stress is running at 60%, then you are really ineffective, and that is a huge impediment. Those are the impediments we need to fix. And if we get to the end of the day on Friday and your energy is over 50% and your stress is still down less than 20%, you're still running at about 3 times the power of the average person. This has been a great sprint, right? So I want to take this whole discussion of Agile, Scrum, and actually get real-time metrics, apply some real science to it. I have a healthcare startup that's working on that right now.
That's really fascinating. What's the name of the startup, just for our listeners?
It's called the Frequency Research Foundation.
Okay, great. We'll definitely put a link to some resource in the video description. And in the interest of energy and sprints and getting to the end of the week and things like that, it's only Tuesday here, but we've been talking for over an hour, I think. And so just as a way into the sort of like, just briefly, the kind of like addressing the sort of thing that some people do skip to talk about, like, what's the person's experience like as a writer? The last question I ask on the podcast, if the guest has a book on Leanpub, is if there was one feature we could build for you, and I'm very interested to hear what you might have to say about that, or if there was one thing when you're using Leanpub that has you shaking your fist at it, going, "Damn you, Leanpub, why does this suck so much?" If there was one thing you could ask us to do, can you think of anything you would ask us to do?
Well, I think you're already working in the area of AI. I would not be able to write this book without ChatGPT. And I also use Bard and some other AIs as well, because in order to dig deep into physics, biology, evolution, complex adaptive systems, there's so much research over such a long period of time that you have to pull up to make reasonable comments I couldn't do it without AI as a partner. So one of the things I'm doing right now is we just spent a long period of time moving everything from Word documents into the markup. I mean, AI should set that all up for us. We shouldn't have to figure that out. We should just, you already have like 3 ways of doing it. And we've gone through all 3 ways. We're finally in the Dropbox with the markup. Right. Why can't I just push a button and say, give me a Dropbox markup environment and give me an editor where I write prompts and ChatGPT fills it in. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's all right there in the markup language.
Right.
Right now, I'm still going ChatGPT into Word, massaging it, then moving it back into markup. I have 4 or 5 steps I have to go through. Mm-hmm. And I think you could reduce that to 0 steps. No steps are the best steps.
Yeah, no, that's really fascinating. Thanks very much for sharing that. That's really fascinating. Yeah, I mean, we are working on some AI services for authors and things like that. But the idea of like, just get me set up. I've got this starting point that I've done. Set me up in my environment would be really useful for so many people. I mean, it sort of makes me sad to think how many authors we've lost over the years, because it's like, if only they'd had that button to click.
Right.
And we did have in our browser editor, we did have a thing where you could prompt GPT, but it wasn't sort of taken up by a lot of authors. So we kind of discontinued it, but I'll definitely talk to Peter about maybe bringing that back.
I setup thing would be the high value thing that would not require that much work.
Yeah.
To just set it all up by AI and give them setup. If they want Dropbox, you give them, you set their Dropbox for them, you give them all the files, and off they go.
Okay. Well, Jeff, thank you very much for sharing your knowledge with us today and your really amazing, stories. I wasn't going to say story, but there's so many different parts to it. But the great thing about your book is that First Principles in Scrum, teams that finish early accelerate faster, is that you bring it all together. And it really is kind of like you talk about energy at the end. I'm so glad you did that, because you talk about it. It's in an exciting way. And it really does. The book gives you energy when you're thinking about like getting faster in your team, and whatever it is you're doing. If you're trying to do surgery faster, if you're trying to build software faster, it's all there. So thank you very much, Jeff, for taking some time out of your day to be on the podcast. And thank you for using Leanpub as a platform for your book.
Well, thank you for Leanpub. I really enjoy working in that environment, and I wish you continued success.
Thanks.